This program is proudly brought to you by the French American Heritage Foundation of Minnesota. We are 501c3 foundation.
I'm Jerry Foley, a member of the French American Heritage Foundation, which is sponsoring this series. The mission statement of the French American Heritage Foundation is to promote and cultivate the heritage of the French language cultures, not just the French Canadians, but the French speaking from Vietnam all over the world, actually. French is, I think, this week, first week, I'll be talking about the early French presence, including the fur trade and ultimately the Métis, the Indian-French mix that was much part of Minnesota. The second week, Mark Levine will talk about the early settlement of the French in Minnesota Territory at that time. Third week, Pierre Gerard is back there trying to help get the camera going. We'll be talking about what happened with the French, how because the New Englanders came in, didn't like the French, they subdued them for a while. People changed their names from that to hide their identity, and how there's a resurgence now in the awareness of French in Minnesota. In the fourth week, Dick Bernard will be talking about the heritage that the French and others brought to Minnesota, the rich heritage of this area. Here in Maple Grove, the publication this week talks about Pierre Bottineau. Pierre Bottineau is someone I will talk about today. A Métis, that it means he was French and Indian, his mother was Indian. Just read a little bit of what it said in your journal here that came out in the last few days. The historical figure had a significant impact on Maple Grove. As one of the first white settlers in Maple Grove, Pierre Bottineau, 1817 to 1895, stands out as one of the most prominent figures in the history of the area. In fact, before claiming the current name, Maple Grove was referred to as Bottineau's Prairie. Of French and Native American descent, Bottineau spoke English, French, and a variety of Native American dialects. He served as a voyageur, hunter, trader, and interpreter. His contributions were of great importance to trade and land acquisition, the early development of the state of Minnesota and the Maple Grove area. He was revered as a guide and interpreter who personally assisted Governor Ramsey and led expeditions with General Henry Sibley. Married twice and the father of 23 children, Bottineau's family name has carried on quite a legacy. You have Bottineau Boulevard, among other things here. So Pierre Bottineau is part of your history here, and I will get back to talking about him a bit later. It's important that we look at our family stories and our heritage, something we don't always do. We learn a lot by sharing our stories, and perhaps some of you at least here have that French background as part of your story. Author Ben Logan says this, that's how rarely Americans tell their own stories now that we have allowed entertainment television to speak for us. That is a loss we are paying for. Authentic storytelling helps us to know who we are and carries our values to new generations. It celebrates the everyday lives of ordinary people whose stories they tell us are not ordinary at all. You all know how the kids with their TV games and that today, their little handheld things, aren't paying much attention to grandma talking anymore, telling the stories and that. That is a loss, I agree with him. So it's important that we share the stories of our families, about connection with our language, French or whatever your background was. Stories about some of our ancestors help us to understand our own story. And it's important that we share the small stories as well, because those people, as Ben Logan said, were not ordinary. Their stories are not ordinary. There's a story here in Minnesota, every street, Marquette Avenue, Robert Street in St. Paul, and to every French town, Terrebonne, Lac-qui-Parle, Roseau, Odette. To us who no longer speak the French language, understanding words like mamire, grandma, or tortillé, the French meat pie, is a story of family and tradition. Small stories that help us to understand and reclaim our language and heritage. I will be using not French pronunciation because I don't know French very much to begin with, but because if I said, well, I'm going to go up to Brainerd this afternoon, you'd look at me, Brainerd. I'm going to canoe on the St. Croix. Or did anybody can tell me where Robert Street is in St. Paul? People in St. Paul look at you, it's Robert Street now, but the trader was Robert, not Robert. You know what the Minnesota motto is? Anybody know that?
It's blinking yellow.
You see that seal of Minnesota? The picture of the man plowing and the Indian riding off, and the language at the top, the Tour du Nord, North Star State. You know what the motto is for Minneapolis, the city of Minneapolis? Again, French, en avant, go forward. So the French had a lot of influence here, even though we don't always recognize it. Well, I'll share some stories of my own family in this presentation. It's really the story of the larger French-Canadian population that came into Minnesota. I'm amazed at how little most U.S. citizens know about French-Canadian heritage, or French-Canada. And I have 2 degrees in history, including a year of Minnesota history, but I didn't learn anything about our neighbors up to the north, even though they're our biggest trade partner, for one thing. I was at the George Bonga play over in St. Paul this winter, and I'm sitting next to a woman, we got talking in the break, and she said, I didn't know there were any French in Minnesota. Well, you can't teach French history, or history of Minnesota, without teaching about the French. I really should say, you shouldn't teach Minnesota history without teaching about the French, because they were a very important part of the history, especially in the early years. We look at who were the first people in Minnesota. It may be the Vikings. We're talking, Bob and I, about the runestone up in Kensington. But the French coming into North America, Jacques Cartier came down the St. Lawrence to what's now Montreal in 1635. And the French came into the area. My first ancestors came to Acadia, what would be Nova Scotia now, in 1604. Louis Hébert and his wife came and joined him in 1611. Louis Hébert was the medical director of the group that came in 1611. He learned from the Indians as much as he could. One of the first things, the first year they were here, they lost over half of their men to scurvy. He asked kids, what are you doing them back illegally, as it were, and obviously frustrated the French government. The earliest reached this far were all cours de bois. In other words, they were illegal in the fur trade. They were gathering furs along with exploring for the passage to the Orient, whatever they were doing. And so we have a number of them. I'll use Radisson and Grossier as the example. They came to Minnesota in 1659, 1660. Grossier had been here before in 1654, had gone back to Quebec with the 50 Indian canoes loaded with furs. And so he was trying to get another license to come out here, to be licensed to come, because it's illegal to come otherwise. He couldn't get it, so he and his brother-in-law, Radisson, snuck out with the Indians, joined the Indians, came out as far as Minnesota. And then when they went back this time to Canada, expecting to be heroes, they're coming back with probably 100 canoe loads of furs. Instead, the government seized their furs, threw them in jail for a while because they were illegal. And so, upset with that, they went to New England, trying to get the New Englanders to join them out here. That's the plan they had. The New Englanders weren't interested. They went to England ultimately, and King Charles III was interested in their story, and that they could go into Hudson's Bay up in the north there, and passage in there, and do fur trading there. And so he claimed that area up north of where the French were for the English. It was named Rupert's Land. Prince Rupert was the king's cousin and the first president of Hudson Bay Company. 1670, Hudson Bay Company started up there, and Grossier had come up in a boat before that, but now that you have a competition between the English in Hudson's Bay and the French coming down the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes at that time. Ultimately, Radisson and Grove City A came back to the French in time, but they were like traders for a time. They went to the English. Jean Nicolet, mentioned he was the grandson of Louis Hebert, came this way looking for a passage to the Orient. He reached Lake Superior as far as he got. Didn't get to Minnesota, no doubt. Louis Joliet, whose father-in-law, or stepfather, was Martin Prévost, was looking for the passage to Orient. He and Marquette, Father Marquette, reached the Mississippi River and paddled south till they got to Arkansas, disturbed that they might be getting in some unfamiliar territory or hostile territory. They turned around and came back. But they claimed that area for the French, even though that wasn't the passage to the Orient, as it turned out in the end. Daniel Grey-Solon, you know him as Sieur de Luth, they gave the name to the city of Duluth, came in through Minnesota through Lake Superior in 1678. And he came down to Mille Lacs, where the Dakota Indians were, and formed a treaty with them and claimed this land in Minnesota and that for the French. Some months later, he heard that the Dakota had 3 hostages, supposedly. I don't think they were hostages at all. LaSalle's explorer, LaSalle's exploration, LaSalle went all the way down the Mississippi to the end. But 3 of his men had come up, 2 French voyageurs and Father Hennepin, and they met a Dakota war party going down the Mississippi, came back with them, I think as guests more than hostages. Hennepin, of course, was the one who saw the St. Anthony Falls, named it St. Anthony in Minneapolis. That's what he's famous for. But they were up at Mille Lacs. Duluth thought they were hostages, came down to get them, took them back to Michilimackinac, and of course Hennepin went back to Europe and wrote all kinds of things about his time in Minnesota. During this time, the Hudson Bay Company, which had started up in Canada, caused a sense of urgency for the French, because they're competing up there, taking some of the furs that the French had access to before. So they sent a man named Nicolas Perrot to Michilimackinac, or Sault Ste. Marie rather, to meet with the Indian chiefs and form a treaty for this area of the country. And he met with a group of them, celebrated, they declared this as French territory out this way. Several years later, in 1685, the French or Canadian government sent Perrot to, would not become Prairie du Chien, but to build a fort on the east side of Lake Pepin to deal with the Dakota Indians. And one of the people who worked with him for a while was a Canadian-born Charles Le Sueur, who gave the name Le Sueur for one thing. Le Sueur came out here and was, again, a coeur de bois like the rest of them, had gone back with some furs, was trying to get a license to come again, couldn't get here, went to France, they wouldn't help him either. So he used the excuse of the land he found down by Blue Earth, the copper, to come back for a copper mine. And he built a fur post at Treasure Island, rather. In 1727, the French built Fort Beauharnois on the west side of Lake Pepin, but the Indians were not coming with their trade very much. They weren't getting enough fur, so it didn't last that long. They closed it. And probably the one you know most about of the French explorers is La Vérendrye. La Vérendrye came in 1731 up Lake Superior, the portage, Grand Portage, into the Rainy River and up to Lake of the Woods, founded Fort St. Charles and Lake of the Woods, was fur trading up there. Ultimately went down the Roseau River to the Red River. But part of the story of La Vérendrye that's most familiar, his oldest son had been adopted by the Cree. Now the Cree and Assiniboine were fighting the Dakota and the Ojibwe at that time. And the oldest of La Vérendrye's sons got involved in one of the fights. So the Dakota were angry about this, and they heard that some of the people from Fort St. Charles were heading east, so they intercepted a group of canoes, But the first one was headed by Rainey Boris, who would be one of my relatives too. But Rainey had an Indian woman with him, whether wife or not, I don't know. But anyway, she convinced them, let him go. They were going to kill that group because there was another group behind. So they went back and found the second group, which had Father Jean-Pierre Arnaud, the chaplain up there, the son who had fought, Laverne, his son had fought in the war. And so they massacred those. That's where we get the name Massacre Island. And they ritually put all the head, they beheaded them all, put the heads in a circle and had to show this was deliberate acts, as it were. The fur trade grew slowly but kept moving west, as I said. I'll take a different tack for a moment. I said that the people coming out here were indentured. Well, in 1659, my mother's maiden name is Paris, P-E-R-R-A-S. In 1659, Pierre Paris came as a barrel maker for the fur company. And his wife, Denise rather, Lemaitre, came the same year by chance. She was a filet de roi, we call them, the daughters of the king. The king was recruiting orphans mostly, but young women to come over to marry some of the Frenchmen. And Denise was one of those. She had 14. She was trained as a midwife and came to work in the hospital in Montreal. And Denise and Pierre married. Now, it was interesting. I meant to bring, but I left some stuff at home. Their marriage license, but the two people who signed as their witnesses were the head of the hospital in Montreal, the woman who was head of that, started the hospital, and Jacques Lemoyne, who was the big fur trade name at that time in Montreal. There were other guests, but those were the two who signed as the witnesses to the marriage of this young couple. After Pierre finished his 4-year indenture, they moved over across the river to La Prairie and farmed there. Now I tell their story here, I tell in this book too, Minnesota, about Foley Paris history. But I tell their story because they had 8 sons and daughters. All of their sons and daughters became farmers, but also worked as sons-in-law, but worked in the fur trade. When you get a license to come with the voyageurs, they came legally. When they couldn't, they were cour de bois. And it worked nicely to be in La Prairie because it's on the south side of Montreal. The Richelieu River runs through La Prairie all the way down to Albany, New York. Albany, New York was an English settlement, was happy to buy the furs. They paid better price than the French, first of all. If you were illegal, you couldn't sell them to the French in the first place. They had better trade goods to trade to the Indians. So often they would head down the Richelieu River to Albany with their furs. By 1676, the fur trading companies were concerned about all these illegal traders, so they formed a monopoly. You had to have a license to be a fur trader, and they allowed only 25 a year. They were called condes. And so 25 merchants could have a license to go out and fur trade. And yes?
Excuse me, who offered the licenses? Who did they get the licenses
It was the
from?
Canadian government, or the French government in Canada that was giving the licenses. And it was hard to get. The rich people got the licenses ultimately. But
Well, and the voyageurs and the
the
traders?
voyageurs were the ones who came out for them. They brought trade goods up from Montreal or Quebec to places like Grand Portage, haul the furs back.
Okay,
Cour de
and they had
bois
licenses as well?
Were the illegal out on their own.
They had licenses as well from the
They know
state?
the voyageurs worked for the people with licenses.
Ah, okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, and there were probably about 300, or rather 500 at most, 400 maybe, voyageurs coming out with the legal trade. At the time, by that time, there were estimated 3,000 young men coming out illegally. Now remember the French who came and were mostly peasants from France.
Right.
And farming was darn hard. Walking that rocky ground. And the excitement of the fur trade caught a lot of them. the beauty of the woods in the country, the chance for making more money than they did farming, because there was no market for the farm goods anyway. Their parents were not happy, but most of the young men joined the fur trade. And then in time, a good number of them, many of them, married Indian wives. And the cour de bois generally lived among the Indians and traded with them, but raised their family with the Indians. And let me just share two, yes.
So the people who were licensed, and then they got, the Voyagers worked under those licenses?
The Voyagers were working for the people with the licenses.
And were those companies then, did they have names?
Those were some French companies or some rich people who had got the licenses.
And so they really just wanted to make all the money for themselves?
Yeah, they were taking the money, well, it was paying the taxes for the government of France and that too. A lot of the money was having to go back to France.
Sure, so the Voyagers then
And the Voyagers
took the
became
other
slaves that were the fur company. They were in
Right.
debt to them, they couldn't
and
get
then,
free of it.
how do you spell this cour de
Cour de bois,
Uh-huh.
Coureurs, Des, bois, bois, woods runners.
Bois, okay.
Woods runners.
Okay, I get it.
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty nifty that they took an alternate route to making they saw that the Native Americans could be their ticket to
Yeah.
that's interesting.
Let me share two quotes from two of the intendants, that would be the civil administrators in Quebec. Intendant Jean Bouchard de Champigny says, quote, "It is most unfortunate that Canadian youths who are rigorous and tough have no inclination for anything but these voyages where they live in the forest like Indians for 2 or 3 years at a time without benefit of the sacraments." Jacques Duchesneau, another intendant, said, "There's not a family of any account but has sons, brothers, uncles, and nephews among these cour de bois." That was the way he tried to make some money most of the time. Just a little about the fur. It was the Voyagers were colorful. I got my sash on for the Voyagers, but the hats and all the other things. They loved the woods, and they very much became more like Indians than the people of Europe. Lived with the Indians, ate their food, really became part of it. They, like I said, they became slaves of the fur trade. The Voyagers were paddling the Montreal canoe, which was 35 to 40 feet long, 14 men paddling. The others, going further up, were using what they call the North Canoe. This would be a North Canoe in this painting, well-known painting. You can see they had usually 8 or 10 with the guy in the front and the back on the North Canoe. And then the Ojibwe Indians had their little birch bark canoes which traveled fast and were light, and they became the traders coming out from Michilimackinac to the Indians further on, bringing goods and bring furs back because the little rivers, they could travel them with their canoes. The people who paddled as voyagers all had their pipes, Pierre's got his pipe, but they measured distance by pipes. You know, how many pipes to wherever they were going. They would take a break about once an hour and all light up their pipes, finish it, head on to the next time they could stop with their pipes.
When I was in Quebec, they used the distance, for a distance, how many pipes can you smoke?
Yeah.
And they used it on land as well as water, and the phrase in French is combien de pipes d'ici? How many pipefuls is it from here to there?
Right, that was how they measured it. Thank you. And they paddled with songs, the voyagers. So the guy who had the good voice and knew a lot of songs got a bonus. He got more than the others because he was important. Pierre, would you sing one of those songs for us?
We'll have everybody sing a song.
Well, yeah, Alouette. He looks like a voyager, doesn't he? Got a pipe and all.
Okay. just to explain a little bit about the Voyager, I'm a Voyager, so I worked for a person with a license. I wasn't illegal courier de bois. But we would start from the Montreal area here and then go into this area. Now, Jerry was talking about where the English were. This was Rupert's land up here. So the English were gathering the furs up in this area, and the French were in this area, and of course, there was problems where the two met. But that's where the Voyagers came from. And so the Voyagers were very colorful, they were very irresponsible, but they weren't like me. They were fit, they weren't necessarily clean shaven, but they wore their colorful outfits. The sash was worn when they were carrying their 2 90-pound packages on their back. They would put the sash around their waist to keep it from having a hernia or busting their gut, really. And this was a century. Then they had these little fléchés things that they wore. They put those over their kneecaps to keep their kneecaps from popping. This stuff also was like fringe, and so they were getting wet all the time, and these were so that they would dry off in a hurry, so they could get themselves dry. Then they would sleep under their canoe at night, and so it was important that they always protected their canoe and their stuff that they were carrying, whether it was the trade goods coming in, which would be like trade metal, and they had the beads they brought and everything, plus they had the canoe, because if anything happened to either one of them, they were out in the middle of nowhere with absolutely nothing. So it was important when they paddled the canoe that they always went straight ahead. They didn't want to get out in the middle of a river and start going around. So there was a reason that they had the songs. The songs were led by a singer, and they always had a repeat. So the singer would stand up and he would lead the song and everybody would repeat, but that kept them all paddling at the same time so that they didn't start this circle in the middle of the river and not get anywhere. And it also was relaxing for them, and then they would stop and, like Jerry said, they would have their pipe every hour, every 2 hours, and that's how they measured distance. It took them 2 pipes to get from Montreal to the next place where they went, and so they knew what distance that was. So now we'll have a song. He said,
tell them what the song is, though. The Alouette.
right,
The lark is, it's the guy who's angry because the lark woke him up in the morning and plucked the yard.
pluck the feathers out of the meadowlark. Okay, now the thing is, there is a story about the song Alouette, and that originally came from France, and then it was really kind of forgotten. And they say that in the First World War, when the soldiers from Quebec went over to fight in the First World War, they brought that song back to France. So now people in France are familiar with it again, but they had forgotten because they were separated from England. Once England took over Canada, they stopped any trade and stuff between France and Quebec. So the people there were very much isolated. And so when the people came here to Minnesota, they only spoke French. And so for the first 200 years of the area of Minnesota, the language here was French. That's the only language that was spoke for 200 years other than the Indian languages, but no English. So now, your turn to sing. Okay, we're gonna do Alouette, and it's plucking the feathers off the bird because he's mad at the bird. Okay? So, we'll start. You all know it, I'm sure. Alouette, chante Alouette. Alouette, je te plumerai la tête, je te plumerai la tête, et la tête, et la tête. Alouette, Alouette, oh, Alouette, chante Alouette. Alouette, je te plumerai le cou, je te plumerai le cou, et le cou, et le cou, et la tête. Alouette, oh, Alouette, chante Alouette. Alouette, plumerai le dos, je déplumerai le dos, et le dos, et le cou, et le tête, alouette, oh, alouette, je alouette, alouette, je déplumerai les fesses, et les fesses, et le dos, et le cou, et le tête, alouette, oh, alouette, chantez alouette, alouette, je déplumerai. Hey!
A little about the evolution of the fur trade, because I've talked about the French in the fur trade. In the early 18th century, this was still natives out here and a few of the traders coming in. But the French and English were usually fighting, and in the first part of that century, they were fighting quite often. By this time, the French colony, little French Canada, is about 70,000 people. New England's 1.5 million already, because they're settling instead. So yeah, quite an imbalance there. So Queen Anne's War, 1702 to 1713, in a treaty that gave England right to trade in the Northwest. Now the English can trade in this area. King George's War, 1744 to 1748, almost stopped the trade out in this area of the tribes. But these wars were not here in Minnesota, they were in the east someplace. The big war, in that sense, is the one that causes the fall of New France, called the French and Indian War. And if you know about that war, it was over fur trade in a large part. The English, New Englanders, were looking at conquering their enemies, the French, up north of them, and they had some problems on the way. In the meantime, the early French Acadians had settled in Nova Scotia. There were about 18,000 Acadians there. The Acadians were French background, but they were neutrals. They would not take up arms for either the English or the French. By this time, England had captured, and so it was English territory, but they would not sign that they would fight for the king or for the English if the war broke out. So they had decided they had to get rid of them. So because not only would the Acadians, they had formed a very close relationship with the Indians, Champlain's dream again. And they married in with the Micmac Indians. They were very close to them. And the New Englanders, who hated the Indians as well, thought the Micmac might get in the fight as well as the people of Acadia. So we got to get rid of them. This book here, A Great and Noble Scheme, is probably one of the best books on the fall of Acadia. And the title comes from a letter written in Halifax just before the war broke out, where the letter said, "We are now upon a great and noble scheme of sending the neutral French out of the province. If we effect this expulsion, it will be one of the greatest things that ever the English did in the American. For by all accounts, that part of the country they possess as good as any land anywhere in the world. So we got to get their land, get rid of them, because we want to go up and capture Quebec and Montreal, and they're in between us."
Would you say
1750,
the name of that?
yes.
Hold it up so we can see
Would
it.
you say the name of
The
that?
title of A Great and Noble
Okay,
Scheme.
that's, okay, great.
Okay.
Can you pass that? Can you pass it around?
Sure.
You don't break the table?
I won't break the table. 1755 is an important date because that's the date that they hauled the Acadians out. It started with the capturing Fort Bourses at Jour, which was on the St. John's River and would be the border between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, basically. One of my ancestors, my mother's mother, was at Toulouse, and the first Toulouse in this country was a soldier there at that time. He had married Anne Como, an Acadian woman, and when the fort fell, they must have been one of the ones who escaped, because a few years later in 1759, we find him fighting for the French against the English when they captured Quebec. His name was Pierre Cressac de Toulouse, and I say that because all the soldiers and many of the fur trade that had a dit name. The dit was to hide their identity. So he was Toulouse, but his real last name was Cressac, and Toulouse became the family name then. After they captured Fort Beausejour, they called a meeting of all the Acadian men. They had come to the church for a meeting with the English, and they arrested them, locked them in the church until they get ships to haul them out. There were 16,000 to 18,000, probably not all of them in Nova Scotia, but most of them were at that time. They probably hauled 8,000 out on boats a year. And they hauled them all along the American colonies. They hauled some back to England, some back to France. But I think the estimate is between 1,000 and 2,000 of them died on the boats. They separated families off, and husband and wife got separated, children from their parents. You probably know Longfellow's story of Angeline, which we had to read part of it in high school. I remember being angry at those damn English for what they did, but I had no idea it had anything to do with my family at the time.
Yeah,
Just knew that there was an ethnic cleansing that happened that far back.
They also draft, because no one would pay for these, like in Massachusetts, if they shipped them out. I had a family, a Boudreaux family. Then the counties, the smaller units, were given no money to take them in, and yet they were supposed to supply wood and the care for these people who in effect were almost prisoners of war.
Right, yes.
And so frequently the people or individuals would then draft these kids and take them away from the family and turn them into rock pickers,
Right.
particularly woodcutters out in New England. And this really plays in because they sent them to sea, I think, in the month of September. So they put the Acadians, that's why between 1,000 and 2,000 drowned. They put them to the North Atlantic Sea in mid or late September, and that's just,
They have a prayer.
yeah, it was very tough
A
going.
tragic story.
And most of the colonies didn't even accept them in.
Yeah.
But Massachusetts did let them in, but Massachusetts was probably the colony most anxious to have that land
Right, right.
for its own colony.
Colonists move up there, right.
And sorry to get
No,
bored.
that's fine. Just one other quick story. Bergerons, my background in Acadia as well. And Michel Bergeron, the first one, was a sea captain. His son was a sea captain as well. The older Bergeron had died, but the second son, who's had a third generation Michel, the parents were hauled off. Some of the family went to England, some went to the American colonies, ultimately Spain, as you know, invited them to come down to Louisiana. And so some of them became a Cajun. Michel, the third generation, led a group. They went up the St. John's River, stayed with the Indians. They're the last ones to leave when the English are capturing and killing off people that they can catch yet. Michel led a group through the woods up to Quebec, and ultimately 3 rivers. They had to stop on the winter over with a group of people along the way. In that group was his younger brother, about 16, Asian, who became the grandfather of part of my family, and married. His granddaughter married George Fallow, who was on my dad's side up in Canada, and Asian married Claire Couroy, who was also Acadian, probably was in that same group escaping from the English at that time. So now we have the English have the fur trade, but most of their people are French-Canadian that are working for them. The people in New England didn't like the Indians, first of all. The best Indian, the dead Indian, they said things like that. So a lot of they associate the French with the Indians, but a lot of them were intermarried by this time, as we talked about. Let me just talk very quickly about the legacy of the French in the fur trade. they didn't set up settlements out here. They did teach the Europeans about this area. They made them aware of what was out here. The relationship between the French and the Indian women was significant. It set up a whole new generation of several hundred years of people who were the Métis, that we'll talk a little bit about later. The French were not prejudiced about intermarriage like the English were. This is a quote from a voyager well past 70, talking about the life of the voyager. "I could paddle, carry, and walk and sing with any man I ever saw. I've been 24 years a canoe man and 41 years in service. No portage was ever too long for me. 50 songs I could sing. I have saved the lives of 10 voyagers. Were I young again, I should spend my life in the same way over. There is no life so happy as a voyager's life." True. They loved what they were doing often, although they were slaves to the fur traders. By 1763, the time when the French-Indian War, the French were now out here in this area because they became very valuable as interpreters, as guides, and canoemen. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 gave the French possession of New France to the English. Now they had a choice. They could keep New France, or they could keep several sugar-rich islands in the Caribbean. They chose the sugar-rich islands. Not a very good choice, as it turns out, but that was what happened. The Treaty of 1763 divided Minnesota Territory. The land east of the Mississippi now belongs to the United States, or to the English, I should say, because we haven't had the Revolution. The land west of the Mississippi belongs to the Spanish, because the French, when this war is going on, had given that land secretly to the Spanish. And the Spanish are the ones who invited the people down to Louisiana, the Cajuns down there. After 1763, the British company now controlled the fur trade, but like I said, usually mostly French-Canadians. Because the British found they couldn't trade with the Indians without the help of the French. The language of the fur trade is French, for one thing. Hudson Bay Company was north of us, we talked about. They were still using York boats to haul. It wasn't nearly as effective. And their man up in Hudson Bay wrote to England, to the leaders over there, saying, "I would warmly recommend that you notice the Canadians. These people, I believe, are the best voyagers in the world. They are spirited and enterprising and extremely fond of the country. They follow their master wherever he goes." In the meantime, the English businessmen up and wanted to capture the fur trade as well, so they started the Northwest Company in Montreal in 1784. And you had to be of English or British background to be part of it. It wasn't long, and the Scotch had escaped in the Revolution. The American Revolutionary War took over up there. This is a busy time in this area now. Grand Portage has perhaps 300 voyagers coming a year. In the summer, when the others are bringing the furs, the Indians and others down, about 1,000 people there, but a very definite separation. The people who own the company, the voyagers, the Indians are all separated from each other. Then we have, not too long, 1763, the Treaty of Paris. 1775, the American Revolution. The Americans thought that or the people in the United States, the colonies, thought that the French would join them in throwing out the British. But the British wisely, in 1775, issued the Quebec Act, which claimed this whole area for the French, or for the British, I mean, but they gave the French permission to keep their language, their schools, and so the French weren't about to join the New Englanders who hated them. They were loyal to the French in that war. Again, the American Revolution was barely felt out here, other than shifted the fur trade routes from up the Mississippi to the Great Lakes again. After the American Revolution, the U.S. claimed this region, but the British ignored it. They still did the fur trade here. And most of the Europeans didn't think the fur trade, or the revolution would last, Britain would take over soon again. Britain was harassing the American shipping, capturing ships, taking the American sailors to sail on British ships and such. And in 1794, formed called Jay's Treaty, where the British agreed to evacuate the Ohio Territory and the Great Lakes and that. And now it becomes the British territory, American territory. But in the meantime, the Spanish are concerned that the British and the Americans are going to come down and take their resource-rich areas of Mexico and south. So they give the land back to the French, what will become the Louisiana Territory. The Louisiana Territory, Napoleon needed the money for a war. He sold it to the United States for $15 million. And the Louisiana brought much of Minnesota now into what's the territory of the United States. I think it's time for us to take a quick 10-minute break, then Bob Parisi will take over. Bob is the artist with these, and talk about the Louisiana Purchase.
I'm Bob Parizeau, and my family came out of Delavan, Minnesota, originally the Parizeaus. I'm half French, half Irish, and I'm going to pick up where Jerry left off, kind of the beginning of the French in Minnesota, and we know for sure that Pierre Radisson and his brother-in-law, Medard Gracilier and Radisson were here in 1660. This is a reproduction of the large painting I did on I call it Minnesota's first meeting of nations, because the French, Radisson and Gracilier, came on an unlicensed mission out of Quebec to see what was beyond the Great Lakes. It was like tantamount to going to the moon today, because no one had ever been, Jerry said earlier that a lot of courier Du Bois that probably had been into Minnesota before Radisson and Gracilier, but this is the first meeting. Here was the Huron, the Ottawa Indians were the prime fur traders with the French out of Quebec, and Radisson and Gracilier were tied in with them. This is a Cree from Hudson Bay that came down to this meeting with the Dakota, or the host tribe, and all those tribes never got along. They got along worse than the whites do, and they were fighting each other. But this is unusual for them to meet in peace. 4 Indian nations: Huron, Ottawa, Cree, and the Dakota meeting at Hastings, Minnesota, in Isle Pelay, that was Bald Island. And I was out there doing research on that painting with the Indian casino people there. And I said, why did they call it Bald Island? Because there's all kinds of vegetation on that island now. I said, well, that's WPA. And he said, but before it was an island that the Dakota would meet on, because they could see anybody coming, any enemies on it. And it was pretty much, now it's growing up, but it was kind of just a kind of a island that had no vegetation on it when they met. But anyway, this started off, and Radisson and Gracilier had epilepsy, and that was his brother-in-law. And Radisson took care of him. There was a lot of dispute about whether Radisson and Gracilier good guys. Well, they were caught in the middle of a kind of a tough time, because they were on an unlicensed mission. The governor of brought in from France on this trip. They said, no, we can't take them. It's too dangerous. We don't know if we're coming back ourselves. We're going to be with a company of Indians. And there was 30 other Frenchmen started with them, but they got attacked twice by the Iroquois, leaving 3 Rivers, and those other 30 Frenchmen returned. They said, this is too dangerous. They went back. But these 2 guys and all the Indians went forward, and they wintered in the winter of 1659 in in Wisconsin. And they almost starved that winter because it was a real tough winter. And Gracilier had epileptic fits, and Radisson had to protect him from, the Indians thought he was crazy because he won these fits. But he protected his brother-in-law, and they got him through, and in the spring they came down to Hastings and met, and somehow the word got out, and this Cree Indians, a group of Cree Indians came down too from Hudson's Bay because they heard about it. Imagine the word of mouth or word of sign language, they all got together, and they had Radisson and Gracilier could speak several different languages, but they had the interpreters of sign language, but they met. And Radisson, who was an inveterate hunter, went buffalo hunting with the Indians for, he said 4 months. I don't think he could have gone that long because they had to beat the weather back to Quebec. When he hunted with the Indians, they may have gone south and different places of the state, but there were 60 million buffalo on the prairie at that time, and they couldn't use their muskets because the Indians said, you come with us, we'll throw wolves' capes over us and crawl up on these buffalo and use only the bow and arrow or a lance to kill them, because the buffaloes on your side, they couldn't see much, but they had a great sense of smell. And they would dispatch them with bow and arrow quietly, because the buffalo were not afraid of wolves, because they protected their young ones in the middle of the herd. Anyway, Radisson wrote about Minnesota early on, and what a wonderful place it was, because he just saw it was heaven because of the hunting was so good, and the buffalo and all the unusual things they'd never seen. No one had ever met the Dakota before from the east. The French had prayed that they would one day meet with the Dakotas. They heard so much about them as the great buffalo hunters on foot, but they were unfamiliar with buffalo, and there were no horses in the New World until it was about the 1740s that the Dakota finally got them. But anyway, that was the beginning of the whole business, and how the Louisiana Purchase started with these guys. Really, that was the first. They were the first Europeans of record to see the Upper Mississippi. There was Courier Du Bois probably before, but they left no written record or anything. But so they went back with 64 canoes loaded, as Jerry said, with the best furs they'd ever seen in Quebec. But the governor of Quebec briefly imprisoned Gracilier with his epilepsy, and they confiscated most of their furs from him for operating without a license. It was a dangerous, dangerous trip, and the richest trove of furs. And at that time, the colony of New France was almost ready to fold. And that load of 64 canoes full of these great furs saved the fledgling colony. This is about 30 years after Champlain had died. But anyway, that was the beginning of this whole connection to the Mississippi River, which they didn't even write about. And there's some dispute whether Radisson was ever in Minnesota because he didn't talk about the Mississippi. But they'd seen big rivers before in Canada, so it didn't impress them that much what they saw. It was just another good-sized river. And so once the word got back, then the Courier boys were more frequent. And the next one to come, I've got these paintings to bring these guys to life. Now there's pictures that were familiar with me of Radisson, and I didn't Radisson. Of course, the Radisson Hotels picked up on his name, but the Radisson Hotel people, they asked me, was he a good guy or not? They used his name, and I said, well, he took care of his epileptic brother-in-law, and he was very brave. He traveled alone and was fearless with the Indians. And he berated the Indians. The Huron were were pushed out of the east by the Iroquois, and he berated them. You gotta stand up to those guys, you know. And Radisson had been twice captured by the Iroquois and tortured, and adopted by an Indian tribe. He was with them a couple years. He escaped once and was brought back and re-tortured. The same family adopted him back again, kept him alive, and then he escaped another time, went back, and then he went hooked up with the Dutch out of Pennsylvania area, and went back to Europe with a Dutch ship, and then came back to America again to resume his fur trade business. And that's when he met his brother-in-law Groseilliers, who had married his sister. But these guys are very colorful people, and Radisson wrote a book.
Hold them there. Hold them there.
Radisson wrote a book about his life to impress the English about the Hudson Bay when the French refused it. And their story of how they started the Hudson Bay idea, they tried to get a ship out of Boston Harbor to go up, because these Indians said you could get in this. A Cree Indian told them that they could get into that Hudson Bay when the ice broke out in the spring and take in their big ships instead of these small canoes. And so when they went, they were in this pub in Boston after their ship failed to get through there. A sea captain named Gilliam tried to get through. He said, "You can't get in there. There's too much ice that spring," and they went back to Boston. They were sitting in a pub, and the ship came in from England. It was the tax collector from England. You know, everybody hated it. But he heard about these guys with this idea of Hudson Bay, and he said, "You know, if you're interested in that, why don't you come back on my ship with me? I'll introduce you to the King of England." And they were anxious to get this thing going, so they went back with him. They arrived at the time of the Black Plague. Everybody's wearing hankies over their face, and people were dead in the streets. And they met the king, and he said, "Oh, you got this idea? I'll send you my his brother-in-law, who was it was the guy that was he was actually he was a German, yeah, and he had the idea that they convinced him that it was a good idea, so he got a whole bunch of fundraisers to put that together. And Radisson kind of made up that story of his life to impress them, and he published the book there. But a lot of things in that book are hard to track. If you ever tried to read his book, he jumped all over. He said he went down to Louisiana too. He never got down there. We know that. But anyway, that was how it got started. And but these guys were the first and lit the fire for the French in Minnesota. The importance in Minnesota was Duluth. And he had come up in, I think it was 1679, and he was given permission to trade with the Indians and to explore and try to find that Northwest Passage out of Duluth, and the city of Duluth is named after him. And so he was quite a guy, and underrated as a explorer. And I made a special point of doing a new painting of him. There's one painting up in Duluth was of him. He gave me a cue, but so many of these people, nobody knew what they looked like. And what my mission here is to make these people better known, because they deserved it. They did so much, had a huge impact. So he was early on the Mississippi. I'm having trouble with my paintings. They're getting worn out in all my travels. And LaSalle was probably the most important explorer in the New World, the Frenchman. And he came in about 1680, and he brought Father Hennepin with him. And an interesting story about he and Hennepin, they traveled over on the same ship from France, and they had carried some of these filles de Roy with them, on that ship. They were orphan girls from Paris, so they'd marry some of these Frenchmen. There were no women. And they stayed at a convent there when they got there. But on the way over, these gals were set free and having a party and dancing with the sailors. And finally the captain of the ship got a hold of Father Hennepin and says, "Can't you get these girls to bed? My seamen are up all night dancing with them." And he said he'd take care of it. But then Hennepin was quieting all these girls down, and LaSalle said, "Let them have fun. They're going to a tough place." So Hennepin and LaSalle didn't get along very well. And so that was how that started. And anyway, he came out through on the Ohio River, and finally got to the Mississippi, and he had Hennepin again with him as his cartographer and writer to record his travels. And there's a good painting of Father Hennepin over in the History Center. I was allowed to look at it for 15 minutes. They keep it security. I wish they'd show the paintings they got. They got so many of them over there, you never see them. But he was a cartographer and diarist for LaSalle's trip. LaSalle then took two explorers and Hennepin said, "You guys go up north and find the source of this river. We're going to claim it for France." So they left, these two other explorers and Hennepin. They went west. They got interrupted by a group of Dakota Indians around Lake Pepin, Minnesota. These Indians had just had a battle with some Wisconsin Indians where they lost several of their members, and they saw these white men, and they said, "Well, we'll take you guys and we'll adopt you to replace the ones they lost." And they took them under kind of a house arrest. They were on the Minnesota River, and then they were going to go up to Izades up on Lake Mille Lacs on foot. And Hennepin and the two explorers were kind of tenderfoots, and these Indians half the time carried them on their backs up there. I mean, that was a pretty good relationship with them. They're unusual, but they didn't know that Duluth had made an agreement with the Indians with the Dakota up on Lake Superior early on to live in peace together. They had the peace pipes and everything, but the word of mouth never got to all those Indians. They didn't know, and they had them under house arrest. And here came these guys, and so Duluth was paddling down the St. Croix River, and some Indians said, "There's some of your people up north." And he said, "Where?" Well, they gave him the information. It was up in Mille Lacs. He paddled right up there with two other Frenchmen, and he freed Father Hennepin and the two other explorers, and they went back, and he took those guys back in his canoe. He went all the way to Wisconsin, dropped them off there to get back to France. And he said, "I've got things to do." He sent them back, and Hennepin is credited for finding St. Anthony Falls. That was the big thing he was noted for. But the thing he really did, when he's with the Indians, he started taking notes and writing about what he saw, the buffalo hunts. The Indians were so interested in the country, and he wrote a book. And when he went back in 1683 to France, he had it published. And that became the first best-selling book in Europe about the New World. And that's largely not known that was the first bestseller. And in it, he boasted about all kinds of things, took credit for himself. He was kind of a character. And but the book was so successful, and that probably is why the people in Europe got so intrigued with the Indians and the New World is through him and writing that book, because he described all of the Mississippi and the rivers and the buffalo hunts, and the buffalo were so different. He was part of a buffalo crossing right up north of here, where the Minnesota, the river up north, the Rum comes together with the Mississippi. And I'm doing a painting of him up in the canoe with these Indians shooting buffalo and the buffalo crossing there. And because they could get them in boats and kill them and float them ashore. The buffalo floated, but that was the easier place to shoot them on the buffalo crossings. So that's another painting I'm going to be doing of these guys. The other guy Jerry mentioned was Le Sueur.
I don't know if anybody in here knows the answer to the question, I sure don't, but in Coon Rapids, I would assume, was once a Mississippi Rapids, and the river was much more shallow than it is now because it's dammed up at Coon Rapids. Does anybody know any more about that question, about how big the river actually was at, for instance, Anoka, how wide it was back in the day before there was a Coon Rapids Dam?
Yeah, I went out there, when I was up here just to research where they were, that crossing, and it's really quite a large river there, and high. So that would be interesting.
I don't know, and I'm just curious. It was, I used to live in Anoka, so I know Anoka. But the dam has been there for many years at Coon Rapids.
Yeah. Well, Sewer's a guy that came, another military guy, an explorer, and he was interesting because he explored both up the Mississippi and down the Mississippi, both ways. He started a buffalo meat processing business with the Indians around Mankato, and built a first fort at Isle Pelay, which is in Hastings. He followed up and built a fort there. And he made the northernmost claims on the Mississippi before Schoolcraft. He went far up in Sandy Lake and so on. So he really got around, and he was at Fort Duquesne was the last fort of the French, was up in around Brainerd on the Crow Wing River there, and there's nothing left of that now. But that was where the last fort of the French was there before they lost all of their holdings, and that was a place of peace between the Dakota and the Ojibwe. After 100 years war, they had peace at that fort. It was built to keep peace between the Indians, because the French were caught in the middle of that 100-year war for all those years. So that was the start of the Louisiana Purchase, and the French then lived with the Indians. That was the start of it in Minnesota, and they hunted buffalo. And this is another painting I've done hunting buffalo. The French hunted with the Indians, and they were intermixed, so there was one and the same. But this guy here is loading shot from his mouth. They'd load their mouth with the shot, and then they'd shoot the buffalo, and then they'd spit the shot into the buffalo's into their rifle, and tamp it with the spit would hold the shot in there. They'd tamp it on their saddle and then shoot again. Well, they could kill like 3 buffalo in a quick run if they did that, because the buffalo could run as fast as the horses and better because they were stronger. Their ankles and legs were stronger. They didn't break their ankles on those potholes like the regular horses was. And the horses would tire out after about 15 minutes, and the buffalo go full speed for another half hour. It was amazing that those big animals could go that fast. But that's just that was the life of the Voyagers, mixing in and living like the Indians and loving it.
Don't the buffalo, Bob, shift the focus a little more to the west and the north? And as the beavers and the other skin furs are getting taken away or removed or traded or exhausted, it puts a new accent of going out on, I mean, I think the Métis follow that accent. They
Yeah.
more and more become buffalo hunters.
Yeah, they were big buffalo hunters, and well, this is in honor of Botno up here. I did a painting of Botno leading a group of buffalo hunters, including Indians and everything else. Because Botno spoke, I think, 7 different Indian dialects. He was invaluable. That's where he made his money, I think. And was so generous with it, with starting the Botnos Prairie and all that business, and the Red Lake and out in Dakota. He was the frontier guy. I don't think anybody could match him. And quite a character. You know, he was kicked out of Fort Snelling by Major Charlie O'Farrell, along with Pigseye Perron. Pigseye was selling liquor to the Indians, and but they kept. He was in good company. If he was in Botno's company, he was not a finer guy than Botno, but he was kicked out too just for being a French fur trader. And I got a painting here I did of him too that there's not enough really known about him, all the things he did. He was quite a leader, and Botno's Prairie out here in this neck of the woods was. He owned it all, and I think he sold it inexpensively to French Métis mixed bloods because they were treated so badly. And up in Canada, they were just destroyed. The English took all their land, and they had been there living with the Indians and farming there, and they took it all from them. So there was he was quite a glamorous figure in history. My interest in all this is I grew up in the prairie of Minnesota out there, Benson, Minnesota. Clontarf was an Irish town out there that, but my folks were French. There's quite a French settlement, Doulets, Boutiers, and they're interesting people. They're mixed blood, and but there's no finer people, more colorful in those people. And but my father's family were French, and my grandfather and grandmother wouldn't allow anybody to speak French because they didn't want to be called foreigners. So that was kind of broken up. We never. I wish I had learned some French, but I haven't. I hope to pick up some now late in life. But any other questions about that period? Yes.
I missed the first part of when you first started telling about this painting. How did they know to go to Hastings to meet these people?
Well, that's a mystery to me, because as I said, they wintered in Wisconsin, around Hayward, Wisconsin, and almost starved to death. And Radisson probably saved the group by hunting a lot. He was provided the food for the meat. But they were in Hayward, and in the spring, when the winter, it was a real tough winter, they finally they got in their canoes and came down and landed on the Mississippi, and they didn't make a big deal of it, didn't even write about it. So Radisson was discredited a lot because he didn't describe the Mississippi that much. I think because he knew the large St. Lawrence River, how wide that was and everything, he didn't say anything. But they didn't believe a lot of stuff he said because in his book, because he was didn't mention the Mississippi.
You know, I'm just speculating, but the indigenous people anywhere had ways of keeping connected with each other. For us, the telegraph didn't start until the Civil War. So even the whites before 1861 were up the creek without a paddle too. You know, you had to have your networks from one village to the next, and I'm sure that the same thing was true with the Indians, including intertribal stuff where they were jostling over this piece of turf or another. We can't imagine it in our day with the iPhones and all this other kind of stuff, but they knew how to keep connected.
They're amazing how they,
And I think the other thing I'd like to say about it is that we think in terms of minutes. You know, you call somebody up and you get an answer. In theirs, it may have been months or perhaps years, where somebody came out here and sent the message back by wow, or they did it back to Quebec that it was okay place, and maybe 2 or 3 years later.
One of the things that there's a nice map in here, the primary place of forts and posts, and often the posts were called crossings, in French, traverse or la crosse. And if you start to look at, there's a map that they've nicely enough put in this volume they published. It's at the very back of the index. I think there's over 100 forts you'd find along the Mississippi, enough forts, posts, you'd find, and they go off on some of the smaller rivers like Cottonwood, obviously Blue Earth, and that's just the southern end, but almost every conjunction of rivers where you could bring your furs down. So if it works the way my Slavic wife's relatives work, they owned a grocery store, often you'd drop off messages at stores and then somebody come in the store who was going there and say, tell this to, that was kind of your Western Union back then, tell this to, and the store became an information center.
yeah, there's a lot of stories of Pig's Eye Perron's place in St. Paul, you know, it was a cave, and the riverboats finally came up there, and there's a guy that, a captain that wanted to get some mail, and he said, well, where can I get some messages up here? And they said, well, Pig's Eye is the place, and that's where they exchange the letters there. They pick them up in the Mississippi on the riverboats in St. Paul. You know, in St. Paul, this is their 175th anniversary of St. Paul this year, and they're doing very little about it. We had a meeting with the mayor over there and tried to get something going with him, and I don't know, I did a couple paintings of Pig's Eye and we and Father Gaultier, and we got to get back together with them again, because I had one of Pig's Eye's great-granddaughters with us, and she was 97 years old, and what a character. She had the mayor laughing so hard at you.
I better take them through the,
Robert Bob Perizzo, P-E-R-R-I-Z-O. That's kind of changed from, my real name is Dalpe, but when the Perizzo came to the New World, they asked him where he's from, and the town of Perizzo, so that's the name he took.
Yeah, and that's in southern France, right?
Yeah. I've been there, it's interesting. Wine country.
I wanted to ask you one thing that came up in the Tribune only 5 weeks ago. It's a curious geographic fact that the Minnesota River, the St. Pierre, was actually more powerful than the Minnesota in terms of volume, and that St. Anthony Falls comes out of the original melt of that glacier Warren, which that's why it has the oversized valley. And it not only blasted past Fort Snelling, but cut back up and made the St. Anthony Falls. Now, by the length and volume of the Minnesota River, arguably, it's not the Mississippi that should be the name that goes down, but when the Mississippi joined the St. Pierre, it should have been the St. Pierre. But the north-south axis of the French explorers that you did so well telling us about froze them on looking for the headwaters of the Mississippi.
Yeah.
So a friend and I, after we read that article, we went looking for the headwaters of the Minnesota. And there is a river called, that goes into South Dakota called the Little Minnesota, that is up on a ridge on what they call the Coteau de Prairie, the hill of the prairie, and that has a tower, and it's named after Nicolay because in his 1838 trip, there was a trading post back there, and Nicolay had stopped off. So, if any of you want to join the Long Live the St. Pierre and Down with the Mississippi, I'm thinking of forming a membership. Just for the hell of it, that ought to get some attention.
You know, I was just out to Benson, Minnesota for my class reunion out there, and I went out and looked at the Chippewa River out there, and that drains into the Minnesota River. And I didn't realize how important that river was, the Chippewa. 'Cause I used to swim in there as a kid. And it was a fast current in there, but I didn't realize it was that important a river.
Well, when you got the Red River connected through Big Stone Lake, Lac qui Parle, Traverse Lake coming down, that connected the Red River, and you find out that James Hill, the big magnet, his first interest was to connect river boats and ox carts to the Red River because he was actually interested in, from St. Louis, he wanted the fur trade. It's only at a certain point America, Minnesota took a right turn and started going east-west. Previously it was north-south. Last phrase on the Minnesota. Also the rivers of even northern Iowa come into the Minnesota when you get down in the Blue Earth area.
Yeah.
So the Minnesota is gathering rivers from the far west, the north, and it's gathering waters from the south, which makes it a pretty powerful contender with the shaky Minnesota as it curves its way down to Fort Snelling. All right, case.
I need to quickly take you through the American
Sorry.
era here, a little bit of the fur trade. After the Revolution, the British were still trying to capture this area back, as it were, and so they were working with the Indians, the Métis, trying to poison them. That led to the War of 1812, or the French and Indian War, I should say, which is 1812 to 1814. It wasn't fought here in Minnesota, but the primary reason for the war was the fur trade yet. And in the end, the treaty that ended, it told this was now American territory. You had to have a license you had to be an American citizen rather to trade in this area. And so a lot of the northwest coasts that I talked about before throughout Minnesota and that now were sold to the American Fur Company. John Jacob Astor was a German who started that company and became the richest company in the United States at that time. But that brought some new names into the area. Henry Sibley came as a trader with them in 1834. By then the fur trade is beginning to go downhill. And there's less and less animals available for one thing, and there's a real eye on this area for more than just the fur trade. 1837, two of the fur trade families, the Faribault and the Renville, helped sign a treaty with the Dakota and Ojibwe Indians allowing settlement east of the Mississippi. And as soon as that treaty was signed, the people came rushing in, the lumbermen, the respective farmers, and quickly ended the fur trade. There's more to talk about with that. Just a couple other things in the fur trade time. The Métis we talked about were strung up in Pembina on the Minnesota side as well. There were up to probably about 1,100 of them there during this period of the American fur trade. And they were a strong group. They then began to bring the pemmican down with the ox carts and the buffalo furs. You asked about the switch from the beaver to the buffalo. That became the big trade item, was the buffalo hides that they were bringing down along with the pemmican from them. Once the settlers came in this area, because the settlers coming in were from New England and New York, Minnesota became the New England of the West. What did it mean? It meant, first of all, that the New Englanders who hated the French with whom they'd fought up in Canada and hated the Indians were happy that they expected the Indians would end up completely gone. But they didn't like the French either, and so there was this amount of prejudice there. That's why, as we talked about a little bit earlier, few people knew much about the French time in Minnesota. I'd like to just share a bit from what I think is our best historian in Minnesota at the moment. She teaches at St. Cloud State. North Country by Mary Wingard, talking about why we don't know more about the French and Indians. And she says, Indians and French had been written out of the state saga. The first generation of treaty makers, land speculators, politicians, and boosters had consciously rewritten the story of their acquisition of Minnesota, selectively crafting a dual agenda to justify the new order they imposed on the land and the people who had called it home, and to assure potential residents that Minnesota was a safe and civilized place to put down roots and prosper. Subsequent generations then came to believe as history the impoverished version that did more to obscure than to reveal the events of the past. Popular history colored the past to avoid confronting the trail of coarse treaties and broken promises that purchased the timberlands and farmlands so essential to Minnesota's subsequent prosperity. Few realized the society built on the ruins of an earlier society, a multivocal cultural and economic meeting ground created by the fur trade and thrived in the North Country long before the boundaries of the state called Minnesota were drawn. So they pretty well lost, and when we started learning Minnesota history, it started either with the settlers coming in, here's the New Yorkers, the timber people and the others, or it started with the Civil War. Minnesota was very involved in the Civil War. And we wiped out these several hundred years of history before that. We'll talk a little about the French with their marriage with the Indians. The Indians, women were very important in this book about Louis Riel, who was up in Canada, but the author says this about the Indian women. These marriages were encouraged by the natives and Europeans alike, for they established an economic symbiosis which fueled the fur trade. The Indian women ground corn to make sagamite, chopped firewood, collected berries, snared hares and partridges, and caught fish, which frequently saved the white trader from starvation and scurvy. She also provided her man with a never-ending supply of moccasins from deer or moose skins, and she netted the intricate webbing which gave the essential snowshoe its support. She collected watop, which is the roots of the spruce tree, and with the resulting twine repaired his canoe. She dressed the beaver and otter furs and prepared the staple food of the Northwest, the famous pemmican, a mixture of buffalo meat, fat, and berries. She also acted as a guide, a language teacher, and perhaps more important, an advisor on traditions and customs of various Indian tribes with which the husband must deal. So the importance of the women in the French fur trade. Come back to
Would you say that?
the settlers
that
coming
book
in now.
again?
Gary,
Could we get
hold
the
up
name
the
of that
book again.
Hold up the book.
What is the
Book.
name of
Oh,
that? book?
Riel
Riel.
by Maggie Siggins. Probably the best book on Riel of all of them.
Maggie,
Maggie, what's her name?
Maggie Siggins,
Maggie.
Siggins.
Was it Louis Riel's grandmother that was the first European?
Lagimodier, yes, she
Yeah,
was the first.
Marie Lagimodier.
Yeah.
Lagimodier. She was the first European woman to the Winnipeg area
Right.
ever. Her husband was a voyager, and the voyagers, if they were married, didn't take their wives. She insisted on going. And then, of course, she got out here and realized that he had another wife out here and a couple of kids.
Oh,
And
And again, in North Country, Mary Wingert says this: with the rush of new settlers to Minnesota, Indian women had a lesser role to play and were supplanted by the European wives. And she says the wives of soldiers and settlers held the ideal that women's role was domestic and confined to the household and family. And the interracial partnership between traders and their wives, who paddled canoes, hauled packs, bartered goods, and involved themselves in every aspect of their husband's enterprise, seemed to transgress all the middle-class white culture deemed womanly and proper. They weren't about to do what the Indian women did, obviously.
Are you gonna mention that she's coming to speak to you?
Yeah, she'll speak on November 1st. There's some, we're celebrating the 175th anniversary of the building of the first log chapel in St. Paul that gave the name to St. Paul. It was built by 8 Frenchmen, and it's the 175th anniversary this fall, so it's at the end.
Some of them also built St. Vincent's in Osseo.
Pardon?
Some of those same Frenchmen also built St. Vincent's, which was St. Louis
Yeah,
and
St.
Osseo.
Vincent in Oslo. A little bit about Pierre Bottineau, your friend in this area. First, a little story told by a woman from St. Cloud about the first census in Minnesota. And after the census, these two people who took the census were talking, and one says to the other, he said, this Frenchman, he said, I could not understand him. He said, I did not know if he was saying his name was Thebo or Bibo. So I said, I gave him a piece of paper and a pencil, said, write your name. He signed an X. Pierre Bottineau was at the fort, as we said. He came down with about 30 other people and lived at the fort for a while. Then he was in St. Paul, helped build the St. Paul wooden chapel that we're talking about. He was well known in North Minneapolis and St. Anthony. And he was up here in Osseo for a while. He was the interpreter for the treaty at Old Crossing up on the Red River in the Red Lake Falls area. He was the interpreter for Governor Ramsey. Now I mention that because not one of his better chapters. Ramsey told the Indians, we're simply asking for permission to cross your territory to go north. What he had them sign, rather, was a treaty that gave the state of Minnesota and North Dakota 11 million acres of 5 cents an acre. And then the money went to the fur traders who claimed they had debts from the Indians. Bottineau himself was living down here at the time. He then went up a bit later to homestead up at Red Lake County, took something like 60 families up there, so that Red Lake County, Crookston, Red Lake Falls area was very French. And in about 1880, 2 families that moved in were the Parrish family and the Toulouse family, my mother's grandparents. Bottineau died up at Red Lake Falls, is buried up there. He was a remarkable man, gave names out here, obviously, too. But like I said, I think one of his chapters that wouldn't be so good as he was the interpreter for Governor Ramsey, who they signed a number of treaties with the Indians that were not true. I mean, the Indians were told one thing, and then something else happened, and they lost their land. Thank you for coming. It's 12 o'clock. We should stop. Yes,
I
please.
just want to say the way you, your talk and the way you ended it, with how, like at the beginning, how people should write their own histories, and then at the end showing how the French history got lost because someone else thought, Hill or somebody thought that another area should be highlighted. I just want to say that in the senior center here, we have a writers group of about 15 people who are doing just that. We're writing our own stories so that, you know, that doesn't get lost. And there are 2 people in it who are writing their stories of their families having been on farms west of Osseo. So
Yes.
if anybody is ever interested in doing that, you're always welcome on the 1st and 3rd Fridays here, right here at the senior center.
Yeah. I don't know if anybody looked at that map I put on the back table back there. It's Dayton, Minnesota. You see about half of the people there at that time were French. This area was French area, obviously, too. Mendota, of course, was strong early point. Faribault, you name a lot of these.
Little Canada.
Yeah, Little Canada, of course. But here is Dayton, and if you look at the names, you'll find about half of them on there are French names of the early farmers up in Dayton area.
1873.
Yeah. Joe, you had...
And really started looking into the social class, where they came from, who married who, and you look, it's really shape, and you get back, especially back just 150 years ago, you really get a rocket ship through history, because all of a sudden your belonging to, or your identity is belonging not to this or not to that. One of the great lines or dates that came down in American unification and in Canadian, they drew the line, you're either national and white and you belong officially to the society, or you're culturally capable maybe of getting on welfare, the reservation, and being taken care of. And that was a terrible split for the Métis. I mean, just a frightful split for the Métis, where they straddled the 2 borders. And they were a moving people, not just the buffalo, but previously the furs. And their friendships and their marriages were across borders. They were into the tribes. They were deeply into the tribes. At points you couldn't tell where the French and where the Indian began. And there were yet other, even occasionally, blacks who were mixed in as Métis. And English and Scots and Irish who are Métis. And as a result, when you get into a jumble like that, you're liable to not come out with a very clear, at least you won't join a country club and think you're superior to everyone.
Yeah, true. If you have French blood, you probably have some Indian blood. I used to joke with one of my mother's sisters, my aunt, that we were part of, absolutely not what we are. And but almost any Frenchman, because of all the intermarriages, has some Indian blood.
One of the questions I got during break was how come we decided to do this class here?
How come we decided to do the class here?
And I live here for one reason.
Because of the French roots here, which are quite strong. In Maple Grove and Osseo and the whole area.
But are you connected with the Maple Grove Preservation Society, or?
This person is.
That's part
Just
of
you. So you got them to come here.
Mm-hmm.
So are you gonna be doing more of this kind of stuff from the preservation societies?
Well, I can't answer that, but my whole dream and goal of trying to video this is so that we preserve at least this history, get it on Northwest Cable, and get as many free copies from them as we can to pass out the history.
And this November 1st one, is that the one that's from 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock?
Yeah, you've got the flyer for it.
Yeah, that's at the History Theater in St. Paul.
And then this is the book that was published about that event. So this gives the story of the building of the chapel. And it just happens, how many of you realize that this whole thing is sponsored by a group called the French American Heritage Foundation? Okay, that's who we are. And we were formed as a group to eventually have a big festival such as the Irish Festival or Scottish Festival and incorporate all the French speaking groups in Minnesota or in the Midwest. And so that includes, there are like 33 countries in the world whose main language is French, but they all have their own dialect, they're all French. But there's a lot of African countries, there's down in the Caribbean, they're all over. So we want to assemble all of those people, have a big French festival, and then let them all showcase their culture and everything. But, so we're starting with this type of thing, get the news out, get the word out, and in doing this, the fellow who actually wrote this book, a couple of his great-great-grandparents, great-great-grandfathers actually built the chapel. So there is still a connection between people in our group and the early French history, such as Pig's Eye Perrant's great-great-granddaughter, being 97, hopefully will be there. And so her
And
great-great-grandfather was founder of St. Paul.
out there in Osseo, Levissinaire,
Yes.
whatever the name is,
Levissinaire,
Mark Levine,
buried
the
in
guy that
Osseo,
wrote
yeah.
that book, they're buried out there in Osseo, and they also built St. Louis, the chapel, which became
Right.
St. Vincent's.
Yeah, so I mean, the stories are all around and they're not that distant in the past, it's just that nobody has talked about them. So everybody's got a story to tell, so we encourage everybody, you tell your stories, because every year there's a new crop of babies, and unless you keep telling that story, eventually it goes away, so keep telling the stories.
So that cemetery is the one that's on Highway 169
Yeah, the one,
near
St.
St.
Vincent's.
Vincent's?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Except I tried to find his grave out there, and apparently it says it's in section whatever, but apparently it's not, it's gone, the marking's gone, but I found a lot of other, sort of ancient French people out there.
Mhm.
I'd like to ask a
Yes.
question to Bob about his paintings. Do you have them on display somewhere, or?
These?
Yeah. or-
Well, I'm heading up to Brainerd after this, I got a show up there. But right now I'm writing a book on, called America's Fascinating French Connection to the Louisiana Purchase. And I've got about close to 100 paintings now of scenes of the French and Indians.
And Bob has done some shows with
Thank you.
paintings.
Sure, yeah, well, I can see it.
Several years ago, there was a group in the Twin Cities area called the Société Canadienne Française de Minnesota, the French Canadians in Minnesota. And we have started to publish their newsletters. They existed for 20, 25 years, something like that, maybe 26 years. And in this book, we have all of the newsletters that were ever written for that group. And they're very interested. They're interesting. There's a lot of information on French history. But at one time, we had 250 people in the metro and St. Cloud, a few areas like that, that actually belonged to a French Canadian group. But, you know, people die off.
This program is proudly brought to you by the French American Heritage Foundation of Minnesota. We are 501c3 foundation.